"If you touch my son again, you're done here, Lydia." Harrison Crane's voice cut through the marble hallway like shattered glass. His 6-foot frame towered in the doorway, jaw clenched, eyes blazing with something beyond anger, fear disguised as fury. Lydia froze. Her fingers still rested gently on the small boy's shoulder, right where she'd found him moments before, curled up and trembling behind the grand piano. The touch had been instinct. Comfort. Nothing more. But Harrison saw betrayal. Rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, each drop racing down the glass like tears the mansion itself couldn't hold back. The storm outside matched the one brewing inside. Dark, violent, unpredictable. Thunder rolled low and threatening, shaking the crystal chandelier overhead until it sang a nervous, tinkling song. "Mr. Crane, I don't care what you think you were doing." He stepped closer, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the polished floor with each deliberate step. "Theo doesn't need your pity. He doesn't need you confusing him. He needs discipline, structure, boundaries." The words landed heavy, each one carrying years of frustration Harrison tried to bury under expensive suits and business deals that never quite filled the hollow spaces in this oversized house. Lydia's heart pounded. She'd scrubbed these floors for 3 years, polished these windows until they disappeared, folded laundry that cost more than her monthly rent. She knew her place, knew the invisible line between help and family. But watching Theo suffer in silence, watching him navigate a world that refused to meet him halfway, that line had started to blur. "He was frightened by the thunder," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He couldn't hear it, but he felt it. The vibrations. He was shaking. Harrison's expression shifted for just a fraction of a second, something raw and unguarded flickering across his face before the mask snapped back into place. Guilt, maybe, or recognition of a truth he'd been running from since the doctors first delivered their diagnosis 2 years ago. His son was deaf. Not sick, not broken, just different. But Harrison treated it like a disease he could cure with enough money, enough specialists, enough rigid control over every variable in Theo's carefully managed life. "You're a housekeeper," Harrison said, voice dropping to something dangerous and cold. "Not a therapist, not a teacher, not his mother." The last word hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Theo's mother had left when he was barely walking, unable to handle the weight of a child who wouldn't respond to her voice, who looked past her when she called his name. She'd wanted perfection, a miniature version of Harrison's success story. Instead, she got a boy who experienced the world through touch, through sight, through everything except sound. So she walked away. And Harrison had been failing alone ever since, mistaking protection for love, control for care. Lydia glanced down at Theo. He sat cross-legged now, running his small fingers along the piano bench's carved wooden leg, tracing patterns only he could understand. His dark curls fell across his forehead, hiding eyes that held more awareness than his father would ever admit. The boy knew tension when he felt it, knew the way air changed when adults fought, even if he couldn't hear the words. His shoulders had drawn up tight, his breathing shallow. "I understand," Lydia finally said, though understanding and agreeing were entirely different things. "It won't happen again." Harrison nodded once, sharp and final. "Good. Because there are 100 people in this city who'd take your job without hesitation. Don't make me regret keeping you this long." He turned and strode toward his office, leaving Lydia standing there with rain still painting shadows across her face, with Theo still sitting silent and small on the floor, with the entire weight of her paycheck and her principles crushing down on her chest. But what Harrison didn't see, what he'd trained himself never to see, was the way Theo's hand reached out after Lydia stepped back, the way his fingers grasped at empty air where her warmth had been just seconds before. The boy understood more than anyone gave him credit for. And Lydia had just made a choice that would change everything, even if she didn't know it yet. If you've ever seen someone underestimated keep fighting, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. Theo pressed his palms flat against the Persian rug's intricate weave, feeling the mansion breathe beneath him. Most people didn't know houses had rhythm, didn't know floorboards carried conversations, that footsteps told stories, that life hummed through walls and foundations like a heartbeat only certain people could feel. But Theo knew. His world existed in vibrations, in the way sunlight warmed his skin differently than lamplight, in how his father's cologne arrived 3 seconds before the man himself, sharp and citrus-heavy, announcing presence before shadow fell across the room. He traced the rug's raised patterns with fingertips that had learned to read texture the way other kids read books. Crimson threads felt different than gold ones, rougher, thicker, more honest somehow. The gold threads lied, pretending to be precious, when they were just painted yarn trying to impress people who walked past too quickly to notice the difference. Lydia noticed. She always did. Theo felt her presence now, even though she'd moved to the far corner of the room, pretending to dust shelves that didn't need dusting. Her footsteps were lighter than his father's, quicker, more careful. They whispered instead of announced. They asked permission before entering a space. The afternoon light shifted, casting geometric shadows across the rug. Theo watched them move, fascinated by how darkness could be just as alive as light, just as telling. His father thought he needed fixing. Thought silence equaled emptiness. Thought a boy who couldn't hear was a boy who couldn't understand. But Theo understood everything. He understood that his mother left because she was scared of loving something she couldn't control. He understood that his father worked 16-hour days not because the company needed him, but because coming home meant facing a son who reflected back every failure, every inadequacy, every crack in the armor Harrison Crane spent millions maintaining. He understood that Lydia stayed late on Thursdays not because the cleaning took longer, but because Thursday was when his father traveled to Boston. And she knew Theo hated being alone with the overnight nurse who treated him like furniture that might break if handled wrong. The thunder came again, a deep, rolling sensation that traveled up through the mansion's steel beams and into Theo's bones. He felt it in his chest, in his teeth, in the soft space behind his eyes. Most people thought deafness meant missing things. They were wrong. Theo experienced sound as pure physics, as force and pressure and waves of energy that painted pictures in his mind more vivid than any melody. Thunder wasn't just noise. It was power announcing itself, demanding attention, refusing to be ignored. He wondered if that's what his father wanted to be, thunder. Loud and impossible to miss, forcing the world to acknowledge him. But thunder always faded. Vibrations lasted longer. Lydia's presence hummed steady and warm, like the ancient radiators that clanked to life each November. She never tried to fix him, never spoke too slowly or too loudly the way strangers did when they learned he was deaf, as if volume could somehow bridge the gap between their world and his. She just existed alongside him, patient, present, real. Theo placed both palms flat again, feeling the afternoon settle into the rug's fibers, dust motes and sunlight, and the lingering tension from his father's rage. He closed his eyes, not because he needed to, but because sometimes darkness made the other sensations sharper. And he felt it then, a decision forming in the air between him and Lydia. Something unspoken but undeniable, gathering weight like storm clouds before they finally break open. She was going to do something his father wouldn't forgive. And somehow, Theo knew his entire life was about to change. The pendant lived in Lydia's apron pocket, wrapped in a square of faded cotton that once belonged to a pillowcase from her childhood home. She carried it everywhere, through grocery stores and bus rides, through early morning shifts and late-night worries, through every moment when the world felt too heavy and she needed something solid to hold on to. Tonight, after Harrison's warning still echoed through the empty hallways, she pulled it out. The wood was smooth from decades of nervous fingers rubbing its surface during prayers and panic attacks and moments when hope seemed like a luxury reserved for people who could afford to dream. Carved from birch her grandmother had selected specifically for its pale grain, Light wood for dark times, she'd said. The pendant held no monetary value. No jeweler would appraise it. No thief would bother stealing it. But it held something more dangerous than wealth. It held memory with teeth. Lydia's grandmother, Una, had pressed it into her palm the summer before cancer claimed her voice, then her breath, then everything else that made her the woman who'd raised Lydia when her own parents decided parenthood was too complicated for their 20-something plans. Some things remind the soul how to listen, Una had whispered, her accent still thick with the Irish countryside she'd left 40 years prior but never quite escaped. Not with ears, child. With the parts of us that existed before we had bodies to trap us in. Lydia had been 16 and stupid with teenage certainty that old people spoke in riddles because they'd forgotten how to speak plainly. She'd nodded politely, pocketed the pendant, and promptly forgotten about it until the night of Una's funeral, when she'd found herself clutching it so hard the carved edges left impressions in her palm that lasted 3 days. That's when she understood. The pendant didn't do anything. Didn't grant wishes or ward off evil or connect to some cosmic frequency only special people could access. It simply existed as proof that some people believed in things beyond what could be measured, tested, and explained away by men in lab coats with clipboards. Una had believed in resonance, the idea that everything alive carried its own frequency, its own way of singing to the universe even when mouths stayed silent. She'd believed that connection wasn't about words or sounds or any of the tools people mistook for communication itself. Connection was older than language, deeper than hearing. It was the thing that made mothers wake seconds before their babies cried. The thing that made strangers on subways lock eyes and know, somehow, that they'd both survived something unspeakable. The thing that made Theo reach for Lydia even though every logical part of his world told him she was just the woman who cleaned his floors. Lydia turned the pendant over, watching lamplight catch in its grooves. Una had carved symbols into it, not letters, not runes, nothing mystical or dramatic. Just waves. Endless interlocking waves that flowed around the wood's circumference, like water that forgot it was supposed to crash and break. The whole world is vibration, Una used to say while kneading bread dough with hands that knew rhythm before they knew recipes. Sound is just vibration we're arrogant enough to think we own. But deaf folk know better. They feel what the rest of us mistake for silence. Theo felt things. Lydia had watched him for 3 years now, had seen how he pressed his cheek against the piano when Harrison's business partner played during holiday parties, how he stood with his back against the washing machine during spin cycles, how he gravitated toward the floor vents when the heat kicked on, always seeking vibration, always hunting for the language everyone insisted he'd lost access to. He hadn't lost anything. The world had just stopped speaking his dialect. Lydia closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling its weight settle into her palm like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Harrison had drawn his line, had made his expectations crystal clear. But some lines existed to be crossed. Some expectations deserved to be shattered. And some children needed someone to believe in them more than they needed someone to obey the rules designed to keep them small, manageable, and forever dependent on people who loved control more than they loved the terrifying, gorgeous chaos of letting someone become fully themselves. Lydia looked toward Theo's bedroom door, closed but not locked, dark but not empty. Tomorrow, she'd show him what his grandmother had shown her all those years ago. That listening wasn't about ears at all. The opportunity came Tuesday afternoon when Harrison flew to Singapore for meetings that would keep him gone for 60 hours. The overnight nurse called in sick, suspiciously convenient, though Lydia didn't question the universe when it handed her exactly what she needed. Theo sat at the dining table, pushing organic blueberries around his plate in patterns that probably meant something to him, but looked like chaos to anyone else. 3 blueberries in a row, then 2 offset, then a cluster, then back to a line, mapping something, counting something, understanding something the rest of them were too deaf to hear. Lydia set down the juice she'd been preparing and walked to where Theo sat. She didn't speak. He couldn't hear her anyway. And she'd grown tired of performing communication for an audience of no one. Instead, she knelt beside his chair and placed her palm flat against the table's oak surface. Then she hummed, low and steady, a note she felt more than heard, pulling it from somewhere deep in her chest, where grief and hope tangled together into something that resembled faith if you squinted hard enough. The vibration traveled through her hand, through the wood, through the structural integrity of furniture that cost more than her car. Theo's head snapped up. His eyes found hers immediately, not with confusion, but with recognition. Like he'd been waiting his entire life for someone to finally speak his language, instead of demanding he learn theirs. Lydia hummed again, longer this time, watching the blueberries tremble slightly on the plate. Micro-movements. Barely visible, but present. Real. Undeniable. Theo's hand shot out, palm pressed flat against the table 3 inches from hers. He felt it. She could see it in his face, the way his mouth opened slightly, the way his breathing shifted from automatic to conscious, the way his entire body leaned into the sensation, like a plant bending towards sunlight after too many days in shadow. Lydia hummed a different note. Higher. Shorter. Theo's fingers twitched. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted his other hand and tapped the table. Once. Twice. 3 times. A rhythm that matched her humming's cadence, even though he couldn't possibly hear the correlation. But he could feel it. The doctors Harrison had paraded through this mansion, specialists from Boston and New York, and one particularly expensive one from Switzerland, had all said the same thing with varying degrees of clinical detachment. Profoundly deaf children cannot develop speech naturally. Sign language is your only realistic option, and even that requires intensive therapy. They'd said it like a sentencing. Like Theo's silence was permanent, and anyone suggesting otherwise was peddling dangerous hope to desperate parents who needed to accept reality. But those doctors had never asked what Theo could feel. They tested what he couldn't hear and built their entire diagnosis around absence, around lack, around everything he was missing instead of everything he possessed. Lydia hummed again, this time creating a pattern. 3 short notes, 1 long, 2 short. A rhythm Theo couldn't hear, but his nervous system could absolutely decode. His tapping changed immediately. 3 quick taps. 1 slow. 2 quick. Perfect replication. She fought the urge to cry. Not from sadness, from the sheer weight of watching a child prove every expert wrong simply by being given a chance to succeed in a language that made sense to his body. Lydia shifted, moving her hand to the chair Theo sat in. She hummed again, and the vibration traveled differently through metal and cushioning, creating a sensation he could feel directly through his legs and spine. Theo gasped, an involuntary sound that probably shocked him as much as it shocked her. He clapped both hands over his mouth, eyes wide. He'd made a sound. Not intentional, not controlled, but present. Proof that his vocal cords worked, that his breath could create more than silence, that somewhere in the complex machinery of his throat and lungs and diaphragm, the capacity for speech existed, just waiting for someone to show him the pathway that didn't require hearing himself to navigate. Lydia pulled the pendant from her pocket. The wooden surface caught the afternoon light, throwing tiny shadows across the table that danced like the vibrations still humming through the furniture. She placed it in Theo's palm. He stared at it, then at her, questions flooding his face that he had no words to ask. So Lydia showed him instead. She wrapped Theo's fingers around the pendant, then placed his closed fist against her throat. She hummed again, and this time Theo didn't just feel vibration through furniture or air or the impersonal physics of sound waves traveling through solid objects. He felt it in the place where it was born. He felt her voice being created, felt the muscles contracting, the air pushing through, the human machinery of communication happening in real time against his skin. Theo's eyes went wide, then wider. His free hand reached up, touched his own throat tentatively, as if confirming he had the same equipment, the same possibility. Lydia nodded, and something in the mansion shifted. Some fundamental assumption about what was possible and what wasn't, about who decided those boundaries, and about what happened when a child finally met an adult who believed in potential more than they believed in limitations. Theo opened his mouth. At first, nothing came. Just breath. Just effort. But then, quiet and rough and entirely imperfect, a sound. Not a word. Not even close. But a sound that came from his own intention, his own attempt, his own growing understanding that silence was a choice he'd never actually made. Have you ever watched someone discover they're capable of something everyone said was impossible? Stay subscribed. What happens next breaks every rule Harrison built his world on. Harrison found the drawer by accident, searching for the spare keys Lydia kept organized with a kind of precision his executive assistants could never quite master. She'd left early that morning, a dentist appointment she'd mentioned weeks ago that he'd barely registered. The drawer stuck halfway open, jammed on something wedged against the back panel. He yanked harder than necessary, and papers scattered across the floor like evidence fleeing a crime scene. Letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to Theo. Harrison knelt, gathering them with hands that suddenly felt too large, too clumsy. The date spanned 3 years, starting the week Lydia had been hired, continuing through every month since with the regularity of someone who treated this ritual as seriously as breathing. He opened one at random, dated 8 months prior. Dear Theo, today you spent 20 minutes watching dust float through the sunbeam in the library. Your father would have called it wasted time, but I watched you tracking each particle's path like you were reading a story the rest of us couldn't see. You understand patience better than most adults I know. The world rushes past moments like that, but you stop and pay attention. Don't lose that, even when people try to convince you speed matters more than depth. Harrison's jaw tightened. He grabbed another letter, this one recent. Dear Theo, your father hired another specialist today. This one believes cochlear implants are the answer, like making you hear will somehow fix what was never broken. I wonder if he realizes you don't need fixing. You need someone to learn your language instead of forcing you to learn theirs. But I'm just the housekeeper, so my opinion lives in these letters you'll probably never read. The words landed like accusations. Another letter, dated the day after Theo's 6th birthday party. The elaborate event Harrison had orchestrated with clowns and magicians and entertainment designed for children who could hear punchlines. Dear Theo, you spent your whole party standing by the speaker, palm pressed against the fabric, feeling the bass from the music nobody thought to turn into something you could experience. You weren't being antisocial. You were participating the only way available to you. But nobody noticed except me. I'm sorry the world is so loud it can't hear you asking to be met halfway. Harrison's hands shook. Not from anger, from something worse. From recognition. From seeing himself reflected in words written by someone he'd barely looked at beyond, confirming she'd dusted the right surfaces and prepared meals according to the nutritionist's specifications. He read faster, hungry for more evidence of his failures. More proof that he'd been sleepwalking through his son's life, while the woman he paid minimum wage somehow saw everything he'd missed. Letter after letter revealed a philosophy he'd never considered. That Theo didn't need to be trained into normalcy. That deafness wasn't a deficit requiring correction. That his son's way of experiencing the world carried its own validity, its own richness, its own worth. Lydia had been teaching Theo, not in the ways doctors approved, not through methods backed by peer-reviewed studies, but through presence, through patience, through the radical act of believing a 6-year-old boy knew more about his own needs than any specialist billing $400 per hour. Harrison found the oldest letter, written in slightly shakier handwriting, as if Lydia hadn't yet committed to this strange practice. Dear Theo, I don't know if you'll ever read these. I don't know if writing to someone who can't hear me read them makes me foolish or faithful. My grandmother used to say we're all just vibrations trying to find matching frequencies. Maybe these letters are my frequency. Maybe someday you'll feel them, even if you never hear them. The drawer held 53 letters total. 53 conversations Lydia had been having with his son, while Harrison had been busy treating the boy like a problem requiring management rather than a person requiring connection. He sat on the kitchen floor, surrounded by evidence of devotion disguised as employment, and felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had calcified over years of grief and guilt and the exhausting performance of pretending he had everything under control. Lydia wasn't manipulating Theo. She was seeing him. And Harrison hadn't seen his own son clearly since the diagnosis, since the moment doctors had explained that Theo would navigate the world differently and Harrison had interpreted differently as less than. The front door opened. Lydia's footsteps approached, then stopped abruptly when she saw him sitting there. Her private words spread across the floor like surgery performed without anesthesia. Their eyes met, and for the first time in 3 years, Harrison had absolutely no idea what to say. Harrison didn't fire her. He should have. Anyone else would have. But instead, he said 5 words that changed everything. Show me what you've done. Now 3 days later, he stood in the doorway of Theo's room, watching something impossible unfold like a magic trick performed in slow motion. Lydia sat cross-legged on the floor, Theo facing her with an intensity Harrison had never seen his son direct at anything except the floor vibrations during thunderstorms. No toys, no distractions, just the two of them existing in a silence that somehow felt fuller than most conversations. Lydia placed Theo's hand against her throat, palm flat, fingers spread slightly, making contact with the place where voice lived before it became sound. Then she hummed. Harrison watched Theo's face transform, watched awareness flood his features, like someone had switched on lights in a house that had been dark for years. The boy's eyes widened, tracking the sensation against his palm with the focus of a scientist, making a discovery that would rewrite textbooks. Lydia stopped humming and pointed to Theo's throat. The boy hesitated, uncertainty flickering across his face. He'd been told his whole life, subtly and not so subtly, that certain things simply weren't possible for him, that speech required hearing, that communication meant conforming to methods designed for bodies different from his. But Lydia waited, patient, believing. Theo placed his own hand against his throat, mimicking her position. His mouth opened slightly. His breath quickened. Nothing happened at first. Then, rough and unpolished and barely recognizable as intentional, a sound emerged. Low and wavering, dying almost immediately, but undeniably present. Harrison's breath caught. Theo tried again. This time the sound lasted longer, gained shape. Not a word, not even a vowel anyone could identify with certainty, but a sound born from intention rather than accident, from effort rather than reflex. His son was vocalizing, not because specialists had approved the technique, not because insurance covered the therapy, not because Harrison had paid someone with degrees and credentials to make it happen, because a housekeeper with a wooden pendant and a dead grandmother's philosophy had believed in possibilities everyone else had written off. Lydia caught Harrison's eye and gestured him closer. He moved on instinct, dropping to his knees beside them, feeling ridiculous in his tailored suit sitting on the floor like a child at story time. But Theo reached for him immediately, grabbed his hand with surprising strength, and pulled it toward his own throat. "He wants you to feel it," Lydia said quietly. "He wants you to know he's not making sounds into emptiness. He wants you to receive them." Harrison pressed his palm against his son's throat, and Theo hummed. The vibration traveled through skin and muscle, and the impossible distance between who Harrison thought his son was and who Theo actually had been all along. It traveled through 3 years of missed connections and misguided attempts to fix what was never broken. It traveled through grief for the child Harrison thought he'd lost and grief for the time he'd wasted mourning instead of adapting. Theo hummed again, and this time his eyes locked on Harrison's face with an expression that demanded recognition. "I'm here. I've always been here. You just weren't listening." Harrison's vision blurred. He blinked hard, refusing to fall apart in front of his son, but Theo's small hand reached up and touched his father's cheek with a kind of gentleness that destroyed whatever remained of Harrison's careful composure. "How?" Harrison's voice came out broken. "The doctors said." "The doctors measured what he couldn't do," Lydia interrupted. "They never asked what he could do. They never considered that maybe sound isn't just something we hear. Maybe it's something we feel, something we create, something that exists whether anyone's listening or not." She pulled the wooden pendant from her pocket and placed it in Harrison's palm. "Your son doesn't need implants. He doesn't need to be surgically altered to fit into a world designed without him in mind. He needs people to meet him where he is. He needs vibration and patience, and someone willing to learn that communication existed long before language gave it rules." Harrison stared at the carved waves circling the pendant surface, endless, interlocking, refusing to break against any shore. Theo tugged his father's hand back to his throat and hummed again, longer this time, more confident. And Harrison finally understood. His son had been speaking all along. The world had just been too deaf to listen. Dr. Patricia Westmore arrived with credentials that read like a highlight reel of academic achievement. Yale, Johns Hopkins, published research on neuroplasticity in pediatric cases, consultant for 3 different national boards on childhood development. She'd flown in from Chicago specifically because Harrison had insisted on understanding what was happening to his son. She spent 40 minutes examining Theo, running him through exercises with equipment pulled from cases that cost more than most people's cars. She measured response times, tracked eye movements, tested coordination between physical sensation and vocal production. Then she sat back, removed her glasses, and said the thing Harrison had been dreading. "I don't have an explanation." The words landed in Harrison's study like a confession of failure. "What do you mean, you don't have an explanation?" Harrison's voice carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "You're the leading specialist in neuroplasticity. You've published papers on this exact subject." Dr. Westmore's expression remained neutral, the kind of professional calm that came from years of delivering news that shattered carefully constructed worldviews. "Mr. Crane, what's happening with your son shouldn't be possible according to current understanding of auditory processing and speech development. Children who are profoundly deaf from birth don't spontaneously develop vocalization through vibration alone. The neural pathways simply aren't there." "But they are there," Lydia said from the corner where she'd been standing silently, hands folded, barely breathing. "You just measured them." Dr. Westmore turned, her gaze sharp and assessing, "which is precisely what baffles me. Theo's brain appears to be creating alternative pathways, routing sensory input through channels we don't fully understand. It's as if his neurological system decided hearing wasn't the only road to speech and built an entirely new highway." Harrison leaned forward. "So it's real. What we're seeing is actual progress, not some placebo effect or wishful thinking." "It's absolutely real," Dr. Westmore confirmed. "But I can't tell you why it's working or guarantee it will continue. This falls outside established protocols. There's no roadmap here." The silence that followed felt heavy with implications neither of them wanted to voice. Harrison had built his entire empire on logic, on data and projections and strategies backed by research. He funded cancer wings at hospitals because peer-reviewed studies proved their efficacy. He donated to education initiatives supported by statistical evidence of improved outcomes. He did not believe in miracles. Miracles were what desperate people called coincidences they didn't understand yet. But watching Theo vocalize, watching his son create sounds that doctors had sworn were impossible, Harrison felt the foundations of his certainty developing cracks. "So what do we do?" he finally asked. Dr. Westmore packed her equipment with careful precision. "You keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Whatever this is, neuroplasticity, alternative sensory processing, or something science hasn't categorized yet, it's working. Don't interfere with success just because you can't explain it." She paused at the door. Sometimes the body knows things the brain hasn't learned to articulate. Sometimes healing happens in languages medicine hasn't learned to speak. After she left, Harrison stood at the window overlooking the grounds, watching Theo and Lydia in the garden below. The boy had his hands pressed against the trunk of the oak tree, feeling vibrations from wind moving through branches, from life pulsing through bark. Lydia knelt beside him, humming, and Theo hummed back. "Is it faith?" Harrison asked without turning around. "If you can measure the results?" Lydia's reflection appeared in the window glass beside his. "Maybe faith is just trust in things that work before we understand why they work. Your son is speaking. Does it matter whether we call it science or miracle?" Harrison didn't answer, because the truth was starting to terrify him. Maybe it didn't matter at all. Maybe the only thing that mattered was that he'd almost missed it, almost fired the one person who saw what he'd been too educated, too rational, too terrified to see. That love sometimes looked like wooden pendants and humming and belief in the face of every expert saying it couldn't be done. What would you do if science said something was impossible, but you watched it happen anyway? Drop a comment. Guilty or not guilty on trusting what you can't explain. 3 weeks of practice. 3 weeks of Lydia's patient repetition, of Theo's fierce concentration, of vibrations becoming vocabulary in ways no textbook had predicted. And then, on a Tuesday morning, while Harrison reviewed quarterly reports in his study, it happened. Theo stood in the doorway, hand resting against the doorframe to feel the house's ambient vibrations, and whispered, "Lydia." Not perfect. The I sound got lost somewhere between intention and execution, but unmistakably deliberate. Unmistakably, her name filtered through a 6-year-old's determination to communicate with someone who'd taught him communication was possible. Lydia dropped the dish towel she'd been holding. Harrison's pen stopped mid-signature. Theo said it again, stronger this time, his hand moving to his own throat to monitor the vibrations he couldn't hear but could absolutely feel. "Lydia." She crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and dropped to her knees, pulling him into a hug that probably squeezed too tight, but neither of them cared. Tears streamed down her face, the kind of crying that came from joy so pure it had nowhere else to go. Harrison stood frozen, watching his son speak a name that wasn't his, watching the connection between boy and housekeeper that had somehow bypassed every boundary he'd tried to maintain between family and staff, between appropriate and inappropriate, between his control and the messy reality of human attachment. He should have felt jealous. Instead, he felt grateful. The moment shattered with the sound of the front door opening, expensive hinges that never creaked, followed by footsteps that clicked with the confidence of someone who'd once owned access to every room in this house. Camille appeared in the hallway, her presence filling the space like perfume applied too heavily. Designer suit, perfect hair, the kind of beauty that required maintenance contracts and standing appointments. Theo's mother, who'd been absent for 4 years, stood in the doorway like she'd simply returned from an extended vacation. "Harrison," she said, her voice smooth as rehearsed apologies. "We need to talk about our son." The possessive pronoun landed like a grenade. Lydia stood slowly, positioning herself slightly in front of Theo, an instinctive protection that didn't go unnoticed. Camille's gaze swept over her with a kind of dismissal reserved for furniture that had worn out its usefulness. "Camille." Harrison's voice came out flat, carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" "I'm his mother." She stepped further into the study, heels clicking against hardwood with each calculated step. "I have rights. And I've been informed that you've allowed unqualified staff to perform experimental therapy on my son without my consent." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Harrison's jaw tightened. Theo is speaking. Theo is being manipulated. Camille corrected. I've consulted with 3 different specialists who've reviewed the situation. They're concerned about the lack of proper oversight, the absence of certified therapeutic protocols. This woman, she gestured toward Lydia without looking at her, has no credentials, no training, no business interfering with medical treatment. She's helped him more in 3 weeks than 4 years of your specialists accomplished, Harrison said, his voice gaining an edge that could cut glass. Camille's expression shifted, something calculated sliding behind her eyes. Then we'll continue her methods under proper supervision. In my home, where I can ensure our son receives appropriate care. The words took a moment to register. When they did, Harrison felt his entire body go cold. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Camille pulled papers from her purse. Legal documents with official seals and signatures that meant she'd been planning this long before she walked through his door. I'm filing for primary custody. My lawyers assure me I have a strong case, given that you've allowed experimental treatment without proper medical oversight. A judge will see that as reckless endangerment. Theo pressed against Lydia's leg, his small hand gripping her apron with white-knuckled intensity. He couldn't hear the words, but he understood tension the way animals understood approaching storms. Lydia's hand found his shoulder, steady and grounding. Camille's eyes narrowed. And she won't be coming with him. I've already arranged for certified therapists who actually know what they're doing. Have you ever watched someone try to take credit for healing they had no part in creating? If you're still not subscribing, drop a comment. What's holding you back? The custody hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks for lawyers to prepare arguments about what qualified as proper care, about who deserved to raise a child they'd barely tried to understand. But Lydia didn't have 3 weeks to waste on legal strategy. She had right now, and right now was when Theo needed her most. The lullaby had lived in her memory since childhood, her grandmother's nightly ritual, sung in a language that predated English in her family line. Irish words that tumbled together like water over stones, rhythm mattering more than translation. Codlad Sam, Aline O'Croy. Sleep softly, child of my heart. Una used to place Lydia's hand against her collarbone while singing, letting the vibrations tell the story that words alone couldn't convey. Songs aren't just sounds, child. They're feelings wearing melodies. Strip away the hearing, and the feeling remains. Now 2 decades later, Lydia knelt before Theo in the library, the one room in this mansion that felt lived in rather than displayed. Books surrounding them like witnesses to something sacred unfolding. She placed his hand against her throat and began. The lullaby emerged slowly, each note intentional, each phrase a gift passed through generations to arrive precisely here, precisely now, for this boy who needed to know his voice mattered even if he'd never hear it the way others did. Theo's eyes widened. His breath caught. His free hand moved to his own throat, finger splayed, ready. Lydia sang the first line, then stopped, nodding encouragement. Theo's mouth opened, his vocal cords engaged with the tentative uncertainty of someone learning to trust new muscles. Sound emerged, broken and imperfect, missing half the syllables, but attempting the rhythm, if not the words. She sang the second line. He mimicked it, closer this time, his neurological system mapping pathways between sensation and production faster than any doctor had predicted possible. By the 4th repetition, Theo was humming along, not the words, not yet, but the melody skeleton, the structural bones that held the lullaby together across centuries and oceans, and all the distance between where his grandmother had learned it and where Lydia now taught it to a boy who would carry it forward in his own way. Harrison watched from the doorway. Having arrived home early from a meeting he'd cut short because spreadsheets suddenly seemed obscene when his son was learning to sing. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting everything in amber. The books, the dust motes, Lydia's silver hair, Theo's concentration. It looked like a painting like something meant to be captured and preserved, evidence that beauty sometimes happened in languages that had no alphabet. Lydia sang the final verse, her voice breaking slightly on the last note, not from technical failure, but from the weight of watching a child discover he could create something beautiful, something that existed simply because he willed it into being. Theo attempted the final phrase. His version bore only passing resemblance to the original. Half the consonants missing, vowels stretched in directions Irish phonetics never intended. But he sang it. His voice, small and rough and entirely his own, filled the space between them with proof that silence was never the only option, that communication could be built from vibration and patience, and the radical belief that every person carried songs worth hearing. When he finished, Theo looked up at Lydia with an expression that asked a question his limited vocabulary couldn't yet form. Did I do it right? She pulled him close, her answer pressed into his hair, into the space where words weren't necessary because presence said everything that mattered. Harrison stepped into the library, and Theo turned, excitement vibrating through his small frame. He grabbed his father's hand and placed it against his throat, then attempted the lullaby's first line again, performing for an audience of the person whose approval he'd been seeking his entire life. Harrison's composure cracked completely. He sank to the floor beside them, one hand on Theo's throat, the other covering his own mouth to muffle sounds that were half laugh, half sob. His son was singing, badly, imperfectly, beautifully. And Harrison finally understood what Lydia had been trying to tell him from the beginning. Perfection had never been the goal. Connection was the goal. And they'd found it in the vibrations of an Irish lullaby that refused to die as long as someone believed it deserved to be sung. Lydia was 9 when her grandmother first pressed her palm against the piano's side panel and played scales with her left hand while holding Lydia's wrist steady with her right. Feel that? Una had asked, her accent turning that into something closer to dat, softening consonants the way her homeland had taught her before America tried to sand down her edges. That's middle C, not the sound, the soul of it, the part that exists before your ears get involved. They'd lived in a third-floor apartment in Queens, surrounded by neighbors who complained about noise and radiators that clanked through winter nights like percussion sections nobody requested. Una cleaned houses 6 days a week, came home smelling like other people's cleaning products, and still found energy to teach her granddaughter that the world spoke in frequencies most people never learned to translate. The piano had been a curb rescue, someone's discarded upright with 3 broken keys and tuning that made professional musicians wince. But Una didn't care about perfection. She cared about vibration, about the way sound moved through wood and metal and air to become something bodies could understand without ears mediating the experience. My sister was deaf, Una had explained one evening while teaching Lydia to feel the difference between major and minor chords through touch alone. Back in Galway, before we emigrated, the doctors said she'd never speak, never sing, never participate in the world proper like. She'd played a minor chord, letting it resonate through the piano's frame. But Siobhan could feel music, could feel when the church choir sang, could feel when our mam hummed while cooking. She'd press her hands against pots while they boiled, against walls while we played records, against throats while we spoke. Una had looked at 9-year-old Lydia with eyes that held decades of grief and wonder tangled together. She learned to vocalize by feeling vibrations. Never heard herself, but she spoke clear enough once she understood that sound was just organized air, and air could be organized by anyone willing to learn its patterns. What happened to her? Lydia had asked, already knowing the answer would hurt. Influenza, when she was 16. Took half the village that winter. Una's hands had stilled on the keys. But before she died, she made me promise something. Made me swear I'd never let anyone convince me that hearing was the only way to understand the world. That I'd teach what she taught me. That bodies are smarter than doctors give them credit for. That promise had traveled across an ocean, through decades, through Una's hands to Lydia's hands to Theo's throat, where it now bloomed into possibility that looked like magic, but was really just patience dressed up in persistence. Lydia had carried that promise through her entire life, through jobs that barely paid rent, through relationships that collapsed under the weight of her conviction that there were more important things than comfort, through the choice to remain a housekeeper when she could have pursued easier paths that didn't involve kneeling on other people's floors. Because Una had taught her that some knowledge was meant to be transmitted through action rather than explanation, through presence rather than credentials, through the willingness to see past what people couldn't do and focus entirely on what they could. The pendant around Lydia's neck, the one she'd been carrying for 20 years, wasn't just a keepsake. It was a promise made solid, a reminder that Siobhan had existed, had spoken, had proved that the boundaries people drew around possibility were often just failures of imagination disguised as medical fact. And now, watching Theo hum his way through syllables that shouldn't be possible, Lydia felt her grandmother's presence like a hand on her shoulder, like approval that transcended death because some lessons were too important to stay buried. She touched the pendant, feeling its familiar weight. I kept the promise, Una. Found another child who needed someone to believe in vibrations more than limitations. Found another Siobhan. And this time, he's going to get the chance she never did. The storm hit at 9:47 p.m., arriving with a kind of violence that made even the mansion's reinforced walls groan under atmospheric pressure that felt personal, targeted, vindictive. Thunder shook the foundation. Rain attacked the windows like it had a vendetta against glass. And in the basement, where the backup generator hummed its steady electrical heartbeat, Marcus Webb made a decision that would nearly destroy everything. Marcus had worked security for the Crane estate for 2 years, long enough to learn the blind spots in the camera system, short enough that nobody had discovered his gambling debts to people who didn't accept late payments. Camille's lawyer had made him an offer 3 days prior, $5,000 to create a scenario that proved Harrison's home was unsafe for a child. Nothing too dangerous, the lawyer had assured him. Just enough chaos to support the custody case. Marcus had taken the money. Now, standing in the basement with a wrench in one hand and a flask of accelerant in the other, he wondered if $5,000 was enough to cover what he was about to do. He loosened the generator's fuel line, just enough to create a leak, just enough to make the pooling diesel catch when sparks from the damaged connection ignited it. An accident, he'd claim. Faulty maintenance. Nobody's fault except maybe the company that serviced the equipment. The first spark caught at 9:52 p.m. By 9:53, flames were crawling up the basement walls with a hunger of something that had been waiting years for permission to consume. Upstairs, Lydia was reading to Theo, not with words he could hear, but with her hand on his back, letting him feel the rhythm of her breathing change with the story's emotional beats. They sat in the library, the safest room in the house, surrounded by books and the false security of routine. The power died first. Lights cutting out with the finality of a conversation ended mid-sentence. Then the smoke alarms, shrill and useless for Theo, who couldn't hear the warning, but effective enough to send Lydia's heart rate spiking into panic territory. She grabbed Theo's hand and ran for the hallway, but smoke was already rising through the ventilation system, thick and black and chemical sweet from burning insulation. The basement fire had found the house's circulatory system and was flooding every room with poison disguised as air. "We need to get out," she said, knowing Theo couldn't hear her, but hoping her urgency would translate through grip strength and the way her body had gone rigid with fear. They made it to the staircase before the smoke got too thick to navigate. Lydia pulled her shirt over Theo's nose and mouth, crouching low where oxygen still existed in small, precious pockets. Behind them, something collapsed in the basement, a support beam giving way under heat stress, the crash reverberating through the entire structure like the house itself was screaming. Harrison was in his study when the alarms triggered, on a conference call with Tokyo that suddenly seemed obscenely unimportant. He dropped the phone and ran, his mind cataloging locations. Theo in the library with Lydia. Marcus, supposedly patrolling the grounds. The estate's volunteer fire department 10 minutes away, on a good night, probably 20 in this storm. He found them on the stairs, Lydia shielding Theo with her own body, both of them coughing, both of them seconds away from the kind of smoke inhalation that turns survivable situations into tragedies. This way, Harrison grabbed Theo, lifting him despite the boy's size, despite his own lungs burning, despite every instinct screaming that they were running out of time measured in breaths rather than minutes. Lydia stumbled, her ankle twisting on a step she couldn't see through the smoke. She went down hard, and Harrison heard the impact even over the fire's roar and the storm's fury and his own heartbeat pounding panic through his temples. "Go," she shouted, pushing herself back up despite the pain radiating from her ankle, despite the smoke making every breath feel like swallowing glass. "Get Theo out." Harrison hesitated, 1 second, maybe 2, caught between protecting his son and abandoning the woman who'd saved him. Theo made the decision for him, twisting in his father's arms with surprising strength, reaching back toward Lydia with both hands, his mouth forming a word that came out distorted by smoke and fear, but unmistakable in its intention. "Lydia." The sound cut through chaos like a blade through fog. His son was calling for her, was refusing to leave without her, was proving that connection mattered more than survival, if survival meant sacrificing the people who made life worth living. Harrison shifted Theo to one arm and grabbed Lydia's hand with the other, pulling them both toward the front door, toward fresh air and rain that suddenly seemed like baptism rather than storm. They burst through the doorway just as the library's ceiling collapsed, as flames found the room where they'd been sitting moments before, as the house that represented everything Harrison had built threatened to become the tomb for everything he actually valued. They collapsed on the front lawn, coughing, gasping, alive. Hit subscribe if you wouldn't turn your back on someone in peril. What happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about this family. The volunteer fire department arrived 12 minutes after Harrison's 911 call. 12 minutes that felt like hours compressed into moments, stretched by adrenaline and fear into something that defied normal time. But before they arrived, before professional help came with hoses and equipment designed for exactly this scenario, the situation got worse. Lydia's ankle wasn't just twisted, it was broken, the bone having given way completely when she fell. She couldn't stand, couldn't walk, couldn't do anything except lean against Harrison's car in the driveway while rain soaked them all and the mansion burned with a kind of intensity that suggested the fire had been waiting for permission to destroy everything. Marcus had disappeared, vanished into the storm like guilt made mobile, leaving behind evidence of sabotage that firefighters would find once they controlled the blaze. The deliberately loosened fuel line, the accelerant residue, the too convenient timing of his absence. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered was that Theo had broken free from Harrison's grip and was running back toward the house, toward the smoke still pouring from every window, toward the danger that his father had just pulled him from. "Theo, no." Harrison lunged, but the boy was fast, fueled by 6-year-old determination and the kind of single-minded focus that came from finally understanding he had a voice worth using. Theo stopped at the doorway, not going inside, but standing at the threshold, his small body silhouetted against flames that painted him in orange and shadow. He placed both hands on the doorframe, feeling the house's vibrations, feeling the fire's consumption of everything familiar. Then he shouted into the smoke, "Lydia." Not a whisper this time, not a tentative attempt at vocalization, a full shout, torn from his chest with the force of someone who'd spent his entire life silent and had finally discovered that silence was a choice, not a sentence. The word came out rough and imperfect, the consonants struggling against muscles that were still learning their function, but it was clear enough that Harrison heard it from 20 feet away, clear enough that Lydia gasped despite the pain radiating from her ankle. Theo shouted again, louder, "Lydia, Lydia." He thought she was still inside. Thought she'd been left behind when Harrison carried him out. Thought the only person who'd ever truly listened to him was burning while he stood safe in the rain. Harrison reached him in 5 strides, scooping him up even as Theo fought against the rescue, tiny fists pounding against his father's chest, voice rising to a pitch that would have been impossible 3 months ago. "She's here." Harrison turned Theo's body toward where Lydia sat against the car, forcing eye contact, forcing recognition. "She's here, she's safe." But Theo kept shouting her name, kept using the voice she taught him to find, kept proving that the connection between them had rewired something fundamental in his neurological architecture. Lydia pushed herself up despite the pain, despite Harrison's shouted protests, hopping on one foot toward where father and son struggled in the rain. She grabbed Theo's face between both hands, forcing him to look at her, to see her, to understand that she hadn't left him, would never leave him, that his voice had reached her even through smoke and chaos and fear. Theo's shouting stopped. His eyes locked on hers, searching for confirmation that she was real, that this wasn't his deepest fear manifesting while the house burned. Then he collapsed against her, sobbing, sounds emerging from his chest that he'd never made before, raw and unfiltered expressions of emotion that required no words, because grief and relief spoke the same language across all barriers. The firefighters found them like that, Theo crying against Lydia's shoulder, Lydia holding him despite the broken ankle that made standing torture, Harrison hovering close with hands that didn't know where to land, where to help, how to process what he'd just witnessed. His son had spoken in complete crisis, had used language not for practice or performance, but for desperate, essential communication, had proved that everything the specialist said was impossible was actually just untested. The fire chief approached, radio crackling with coordinates and instructions. Everyone accounted for. Harrison nodded, unable to speak past the emotion lodging in his throat like physical obstruction. "Good." The chief surveyed the burning mansion with the professional detachment of someone who'd seen too many structures claimed by flame. "Looks like arson. Deliberate fuel line sabotage in the basement. We'll need statements once we get this contained." Marcus's betrayal. Camille's desperation manifesting in violence. $5,000 to prove Harrison's home was unsafe, delivered by someone willing to risk lives for cash. But standing in the rain, watching Theo cling to Lydia while sirens wailed and his mansion collapsed room by room, Harrison realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Home was never the building. Home was whoever taught you it was safe to use your voice. And his son had just learned that lesson in the most terrifying way possible. Would you forgive someone who put your child in danger for money? Stay subscribed. The aftermath is where truth finally surfaces. The hospital kept Lydia overnight for smoke inhalation and to set her ankle, a clean break that would heal in 6 weeks with proper care. They tried to keep Theo for observation too, but he refused to leave her room, planting himself in the chair beside her bed with the immovable determination of someone who'd already lost too much that night. Harrison didn't fight it, just pulled up a second chair and settled in for the long night ahead. By morning, the story had leaked. Not the arson. Investigators were still building that case. But the miracle, a profoundly deaf child shouting for his caregiver through smoke and chaos, using speech that every specialist had said was neurologically impossible. Dr. Westmore returned, this time bringing colleagues from MIT and Stanford who'd heard rumors and needed to see for themselves. They descended on Theo with gentle urgency, running tests that measured what his brain was doing with vibration, how his neural pathways had rewired themselves around the absence of auditory input. The scans told a story that rewrote textbooks. Theo's brain had created entirely new processing channels, routing tactile sensation through areas typically reserved for language development, building bridges between sensory systems that usually operated independently. His neuroplasticity wasn't just impressive, it was unprecedented. "This changes everything," Dr. Westmore said quietly, reviewing results that looked like science fiction rendered in medical imaging. Not just for Theo, but for how we understand childhood development, sensory processing, and the brain's capacity for adaptation. The specialists wanted to publish papers, present findings at conferences, turn Theo into a case study that would define careers and shift paradigms. Harrison told them no. "My son isn't research," he said, his voice carrying the kind of finality that came from almost losing everything that mattered. "He's a person who learned to speak because someone believed in him. That's the only story that matters." But Theo was speaking now with increasing clarity. Not perfectly, not without effort, but undeniably. Words emerged rough but recognizable, his vocabulary expanding daily as his confidence grew. He called Lydia by name without the slurred consonants, called his father Dada with only slight distortion, said hungry and tired, and book with the determination of someone making up for lost time. The media caught wind despite Harrison's attempts at privacy. Local news stations ran segments about the miracle child who'd learned to speak through vibration. National networks picked it up. Within 72 hours, Theo's story had gone viral in that peculiar modern way where strangers felt entitled to opinions about other people's medical journeys. Harrison accepted it because fighting media attention required energy he'd rather spend on his son. Because the alternative, keeping Theo hidden, felt like shame disguised as protection. And because somewhere deep in the parts of himself he rarely acknowledged, Harrison wanted the world to know what Lydia had accomplished with nothing but patience and a wooden pendant and the willingness to meet a child where he was, instead of demanding he travel to where everyone else expected him to be. The specialists left eventually, taking their scans and theories and requests for follow-up testing. Dr. Westmore lingered, reviewing one last report before departing. "For what it's worth," she said to Harrison, "I don't think this was entirely neuroplasticity. I think it was love creating conditions where neuroplasticity could thrive. Science can measure the results, but it can't replicate the catalyst." She glanced at Lydia, still in the hospital bed with her ankle elevated, with Theo asleep against her side, despite 3 nurses insisting children weren't allowed overnight in adult recovery rooms. "Some things," Dr. Westmore finished, "work because people care enough to make them work. That's not in any journal, but it's in every case where patients exceed expectations." After she left, Harrison sat in the dimly lit hospital room, watching Theo sleep, watching Lydia's hand rest protectively on the boy's shoulder even in unconsciousness. His son could speak. Not because of money, not because of credentials, not because of any intervention Harrison's wealth could purchase. Because a housekeeper with a dead grandmother's philosophy had believed in vibrations more than limitations. The internet did what the internet does best, turned a nuanced story into ammunition for pre-existing arguments. Theo's case became a battleground. Medical professionals debated in academic forums whether the documented neuroplasticity was reproducible or simply an outlier case that proved nothing except statistical variance. They dissected methodology, questioned timelines, demanded peer review of findings that hadn't been formally published yet. Faith communities claimed divine intervention, pointing to Theo's progress as evidence that prayer and belief could override medical prognosis. They shared videos, created hashtags, turned a 6-year-old speech development into proof of whatever theological position they'd already committed to defending. Disability advocates split into camps, some celebrating that barriers were being challenged, others concerned that Theo's story would be weaponized against deaf children who didn't vocalize, suggesting that failure to speak indicated lack of effort rather than valid alternative communication. The comment sections became war zones. "This is fake. Profoundly deaf kids don't spontaneously develop speech. My cousin did something similar with music therapy. It's real, just rare. Stop making this kid perform for your inspiration. Deaf people don't need to speak to be valid. If this family can do it with vibrations, why are we wasting money on cochlear implants?" Harrison stopped reading after the first 100 comments. stopped engaging with the narrative being constructed around his son by people who'd never met Theo, never watched him struggle, never saw the moment he discovered his own voice. But Camille saw opportunity. Her legal team pivoted immediately, filing emergency motions arguing that the media attention proved Harrison was exploiting their son, that Theo's privacy was being violated, that a responsible parent would shield the child from public scrutiny rather than allowing him to become a spectacle. The irony, that her own sabotage attempt had created the crisis that led to Theo's most dramatic vocalization, was lost on exactly no one except Camille herself. The custody hearing was rescheduled, moved up due to urgent circumstances regarding the minor child's well-being. And somewhere in the chaos of opinions and debates and legal maneuvering, Theo kept speaking, kept learning, kept proving that the only opinion that mattered was his own growing confidence that he had something worth saying and people worth saying it to. The temporary rental house Harrison secured while the mansion underwent repairs had 4 bedrooms, outdated appliances, and absolutely none of the grandeur that had defined their previous life. Theo loved it immediately. No marble hallways that echoed with the weight of expectation. No staff maintaining invisible standards of perfection. Just a regular house on a regular street where neighbors walked dogs and kids rode bikes, and nobody cared that the Cranes were living like normal people for the first time in years. Harrison had cleared his schedule, canceled meetings, delegated responsibilities, told his executive team that family emergencies took precedence over quarterly projections. They'd looked at him like he'd announced early retirement, but he didn't care. His son could speak now, and Harrison had almost missed the entire journey because he'd been too busy managing everything, except what actually mattered. Mornings became their ritual. Harrison would wake Theo by placing a hand on his shoulder, gentle pressure instead of words the boy couldn't hear, and they'd make breakfast together. Scrambled eggs that came out slightly rubbery, toast burned around the edges, orange juice poured with more enthusiasm than precision. It was terrible and perfect. Theo would hum while cooking, testing sounds against the kitchen's acoustics, feeling how vibrations changed when he stood near the refrigerator versus by the window. Harrison learned to hum back, creating conversations that had no words but carried meaning through rhythm and response. Lydia came by daily, her broken ankle healing, but still requiring a walking boot that slowed her usual efficiency. She'd moved from employee to something Harrison didn't have words for yet. Advisor, guide, the person who understood Theo's needs better than anyone, including his parents. She taught Harrison what she'd learned through trial and error, that Theo responded best to consistent vibrations, that sudden changes in air pressure made him anxious, that he used touch to map emotional landscapes the way hearing people use tone of voice. He's not broken, Lydia reminded Harrison one afternoon while they watched Theo build elaborate structures with blocks, pressing his palm against each piece before placing it to feel the wood's individual character. He never was. He just experiences the world through different channels than you expected. Harrison nodded, watching his son work with the kind of focused intensity he'd inherited from his father, but applied to entirely different pursuits. I wasted 3 years trying to fix something that didn't need fixing. You were scared, Lydia said simply. Fear makes people try to control what they should be learning from. They fell into new patterns. Harrison reading to Theo with his hand on the boy's back, letting breath and rhythm tell stories. Theo teaching his father which household sounds created the most interesting vibrations. The washing machine during spin cycle, the garage door opening, rain against windows. Father and son learning each other's languages instead of one demanding the other assimilate. The custody hearing loomed 2 weeks away, but Harrison felt less anxious than he had when this started, because now he had evidence that mattered more than any lawyer's arguments. He had a relationship with his son built on understanding rather than expectations. Theo had started calling him Dada regularly now, the word still slightly distorted, but improving daily. Each time Harrison heard it, something in his chest cracked open, not breaking, but expanding to accommodate feelings he'd been too defended to experience before. One evening, Theo crawled into Harrison's lap during dinner, something he'd never done in the mansion, where proximity felt like violation of unspoken boundaries about appropriate distance between parent and child. He placed his small hand against Harrison's throat and waited. Harrison understood immediately. He hummed their song, the lullaby Lydia had taught them both, the one that connected Theo to generations of people who believed in vibration over limitation. Theo hummed along, their voices creating harmonies that weren't quite music, but definitely qualified as conversation. And Harrison realized this was what he'd been missing. Not a son who fit expectations, but a son who existed fully as himself, offering connection in the only language that mattered, the language of presence. The photograph surfaced while Harrison was sorting through salvaged items from the mansion's fire damage. Most of the house had been destroyed, the library completely lost, the study smoke-damaged beyond repair. But the safe in his father's old office had protected its contents. Legal documents, family heirlooms, and a leather album Harrison hadn't opened since his father's funeral 8 years prior. He almost didn't look inside, almost set it aside for later, for when grief felt less immediate, less likely to ambush him in rental houses that smelled like other people's lives. But something, instinct, curiosity, fate wearing coincidence as camouflage, made him flip open the cover. The first photograph stopped his breath entirely. Black and white, edges yellowed with age, dated 1982 in his father's precise handwriting. The image showed a young woman, maybe 30, hair dark and thick, smile genuine, standing beside Harrison's father outside what looked like a hospital entrance. Harrison didn't recognize her immediately, but he recognized what she wore around her neck, a wooden pendant carved with interlocking waves, hanging from a simple cord. His hands shook as he turned the photograph over. His father's handwriting again, neat and deliberate. Una McCarthy. The woman who taught me that healing isn't always about medicine. The name detonated in Harrison's mind like controlled demolition of every assumption he'd built his understanding on. Una. Lydia's grandmother. The woman who'd carved the pendant, who'd taught Lydia about vibrations, who'd promised her sister's memory wouldn't die as long as someone remembered that deafness wasn't disability. Harrison pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, texting Lydia, "Need you to come over. Found something important." She arrived 20 minutes later, walking boot, slowing her progress up the rental's front steps. Harrison met her at the door, photograph in hand, questions written across his face in expressions words couldn't quite capture. "Your grandmother," he said without preamble. "Una McCarthy. She knew my father." Lydia's eyes widened. She took the photograph carefully, studying it with the intensity of someone confronting impossible connections between past and present. "I didn't know." She never mentioned. Her voice broke. "When did they meet?" Harrison gestured to the album, to other photographs documenting a relationship he'd never known existed. His father at what looked like a community center, surrounded by children. Una teaching, demonstrating something with her hands, while kids watched with rapt attention. Another photo showed his father receiving the pendant, Una placing it around his neck with ceremony that suggested this meant more than casual gift-giving. "My father had it for years," Harrison said quietly. "I found it in his effects after he died. Never knew where it came from. Never thought to ask when he was alive. I just kept it. Wore it sometimes when I missed him." He pulled the pendant from his own pocket, the same one Lydia had been carrying, the one that had somehow traveled from Una to his father, to him, to Lydia, and finally to Theo. A circle completing itself across generations. "After the fire," Harrison continued, "I gave it to you. Told you to keep it safe because it felt important, even though I didn't understand why. I thought I was just being sentimental about my father's belongings." Lydia traced the carved waves with one finger, tears streaming down her face. Una used to talk about a man who learned to listen, a businessman who came to her workshops skeptical and left believing. She said he promised to remember what she taught him, to pass it forward when the time came. My father was diagnosed with early-onset dementia when I was 25, Harrison said, voice rough with emotion he'd buried for years. He deteriorated fast. But even at the end, even when he didn't remember my name, he'd hum. These specific patterns, these rhythms I never understood. He demonstrated. Humming the lullaby Lydia had taught Theo, the one that supposedly came from her grandmother's Irish heritage. Lydia gasped. That's the song. That's Una's lullaby. The pieces assembled themselves into a picture neither of them had seen coming. Una teaching Harrison's father about vibration and connection. His father wearing the pendant, carrying the philosophy even as his mind failed him. The pendant finding its way to Harrison, waiting dormant until the exact moment his son needed what it represented. This was never coincidence, Lydia whispered. You hiring me, Theo needing help the pendant. It was my father keeping a promise, Harrison finished. Even after death, even through fire and chaos and time, making sure what Una taught him reached the child who needed it most. They stood in the rental house's cramped living room, holding a photograph that proved their families had been connected long before either of them knew, bound by belief that some knowledge was too important to let die with the people who carried it. Theo appeared in the doorway, drawn by their emotion even though he couldn't hear their conversation. He looked between them with questions in his eyes, then reached for the pendant Lydia still held. She placed it in his palm, the third generation to receive what Una had carved from birch wood 50 years ago, what she'd infused with the promise that deafness would never mean silence as long as someone remembered how to listen. Theo closed his fingers around it and smiled. Not because he understood the history, but because he felt its weight, its purpose, its intention surviving decades to arrive precisely here. Would you believe it if 3 generations collided to save one child? Comment below. Do you think this was fate or just incredible timing? The custody hearing ended before it truly began. Marcus's confession, delivered through his lawyer once arson charges were filed, detailed Camille's involvement in the sabotage. Her lawyer withdrew, her case collapsed, and supervised visitation was the best outcome she could negotiate. Harrison won custody by default, though winning felt like the wrong word for watching his ex-wife's desperation consume her judgment so completely she'd endangered the child she claimed to want. But the hearing's end created space for something better than legal victory: actual progress. Harrison established the Una McCarthy Foundation 3 months after the fire, funding research into alternative communication methods for deaf children. Not to fix them, not to make them conform, but to explore how vibration, touch, and neuroplasticity could create pathways that hearing-centric approaches had overlooked. He offered Lydia the position of director, 6-figure salary, benefits, the kind of professional recognition her work deserved. She turned it down. I'm not an administrator, she said simply. I'm a teacher. Put the money toward helping kids, not pay me to sit in meetings. So Harrison got creative. He funded a full scholarship for Lydia to pursue certification in deaf education, the credentials she'd never been able to afford, packaged with living expenses, so money wasn't an obstacle. She accepted that. Started classes the following semester while continuing to work with Theo, building a model for vibration-based therapy that other practitioners could learn from. Theo became her assistant, testing methods, demonstrating techniques, creating tools with the kind of innovation that came from lived experience rather than theoretical study. At 8 years old, he designed a vest embedded with haptic feedback sensors that translated environmental sounds into vibration patterns. Not to make deaf children hear, but to give them another way to process their surroundings, to feel conversations and music and doorbells through technology that met them where they were. The prototype looked rough, wires and battery packs held together with Velcro and determination, but it worked. Theo wore it to school, shared it with 2 other deaf students in his integrated classroom, refined it based on their feedback. By 9, he was filing patent applications with Harrison's help, donating proceeds to the Listen Within initiative, The nonprofit Lydia had founded to teach Una's methods to parents and educators who'd been told vibration therapy was pseudoscience. The Listen Within initiative operated from a renovated community center 3 blocks from where Una had taught workshops 40 years prior. Same neighborhood, same philosophy, updated for a generation that had better technology, but still needed the fundamental reminder that communication was older than language, deeper than hearing, more essential than any method that required everyone to conform to a single standard. Lydia taught 3 days a week, working with deaf children, their families, educators who wanted alternatives to approaches that treated deafness as deficit. She taught them to hum, to feel, to trust that bodies knew things before brains categorized them into possible or impossible. Harrison attended every graduation, watched families discover what he'd almost missed. That limitation often lived in perspective rather than physiology, that bridges could be built from patience and belief, and the willingness to admit that experts didn't know everything. Theo spoke clearly now, not perfectly, but authentically. His voice carried the slight distortion of someone who'd learned vocalization through touch rather than audition, but it was distinctly his. He used sign language too, refusing to choose between communication methods because he'd learned that fluency came in multiple forms. The mansion was rebuilt, but they didn't move back immediately. The rental had become home in ways square footage and marble couldn't replicate. Eventually they returned, but the new house felt different. Less museum, more residence. Theo's vibration lab occupied the space where Harrison's study used to be. The library was rebuilt with acoustic panels designed to amplify the sensations Theo used to navigate text. And in the entry hall, mounted in a case that protected it from damage, but kept it visible, the wooden pendant hung on display. Una's legacy made tangible, a reminder that some gifts traveled through time to reach exactly who needed them when they needed them most. 5 years after the fire, Lydia returned to the mansion for Theo's 12th birthday. She'd been traveling, keynote speeches at education conferences, consultations with schools implementing vibration-based programs, training sessions for therapists who wanted to add her methods to their practice. The Listen Within initiative had expanded to 7 cities. Research papers cited Theo's case regularly. Deaf children across the country were learning that their way of experiencing sound was valid, valuable, worth celebrating rather than correcting. But today, Lydia was just here for cake and watching a boy she'd helped raise become someone extraordinary. Theo met her at the door, taller now, voice deeper, but still carrying those telltale markers of speech learned through sensation rather than hearing. Lydia. He hugged her with the unself-conscious affection of someone who'd never learned that adults were supposed to maintain professional distance. Come see what we finished. He dragged her toward his lab, the space that had evolved from childhood experiments to legitimate research facility. Workbenches held prototypes of devices Theo had designed, advanced haptic vests, floor panels that translated music into vibration patterns, even a modified piano that provided tactile feedback for each note. But what stopped Lydia's breath was the photograph on the wall, enlarged, restored, printed with museum-quality care. The picture of Una and Harrison's father, standing outside that hospital in 1982, wearing matching pendants carved from birch. Dad found more in grandfather's papers, Theo explained, his signing accompanying his speech the way bilingual people code-switched. Letters between him and your grandmother. They planned this, kind of. Not specifically, but they hoped their work would continue after they were gone. Lydia moved closer, reading portions of correspondence she'd never known existed. Her grandmother's handwriting discussing children who needed someone to believe in vibrations. Harrison's father responding with funding offers, connections to researchers, promises to ensure the work survived them both. A partnership that had bloomed in community centers and hospital waiting rooms, that had planted seeds taking decades to grow into forests. They knew, Theo said softly, knew that people like me would keep coming, keep being told we couldn't do things, keep needing someone to show us different paths. He placed his hand against the photograph, feeling the texture of paper, connecting across years to people he'd never met, but who'd shaped his entire existence. So I made something for them. For all of us. Theo led Lydia to the back garden, where the rebuilt mansion's grounds stretched toward sunset-painted sky. Golden light caught the edges of everything: trees, grass, the stone pathway leading to what looked like an outdoor amphitheater. Except instead of traditional seating, platforms covered the ground, each one engineered to transmit vibrations from a central stage where musicians could play while deaf audience members felt every note through surfaces designed specifically for that purpose. The Una stage, Theo announced proudly. Free concerts every month. Half the audience deaf, half hearing, everyone experiencing music together. Not separately, not with one group translating for another, but actually together. Lydia's hand covered her mouth, tears flowing freely. This was what Una had dreamed. What she'd worked toward in cramped workshops with donated equipment and families who couldn't afford private therapy. She'd imagined a world where deafness wasn't lack, where children like her sister Siobhan could participate fully, where connection mattered more than conformity. And here it was, built by a boy who'd learned to speak through vibrations, funded by a father who'd learned to listen, inspired by a grandmother who'd refused to let expertise override experience. The first concert was scheduled for tonight. Already people were gathering, deaf children running across the platforms, feeling the resonance of their footsteps. Parents setting up picnic blankets. Musicians tuning instruments that would paint pictures in vibration rather than sound. Harrison appeared beside Lydia, silver threads in his hair now, face lined with the kind of aging that came from actual living rather than performing life. She would have loved this. She'd as love it, Lydia corrected gently. Somewhere, somehow, she sees what her promise became. The sun dropped lower, painting everything in amber and gold. Theo took the stage, not to perform, but to welcome everyone in both English and sign language, his voice carrying across the garden while his hands ensured no one was excluded from the greeting. He hummed the lullaby, Una's song, his song, the song that had traveled through generations to teach him that voices mattered even when they came through unconventional channels. The audience hummed back. Some heard themselves. Some felt themselves. All of them participated in something older than language, deeper than words. Lydia closed her eyes and felt the vibrations travel through the ground, through her bones, through every cell that carried Una's DNA and philosophy forward into futures her grandmother never saw, but absolutely believed in. The mansion glowed behind them, rebuilt but transformed. Not a monument to wealth anymore, but a laboratory for possibility. A reminder that sometimes the most important work happened in margins that experts overlooked, in spaces where housekeepers taught billionaires about what mattered more than money. Theo caught her eye from the stage and signed simply, "Thank you." She signed back, "Thank your great-grandmother." And never stop humming. If you believe the world needs more people like Lydia, people who see potential where others see problems, hit subscribe. Because every child deserves someone who listens in their language, not just the language everyone else expects them to learn. The ripples started small. A mother in Ohio who'd watched Theo's story on the news, who tried humming to her 4-year-old daughter the way Lydia had demonstrated in interviews. The daughter, diagnosed profoundly deaf at birth, vocalized for the first time within 3 weeks. Then a teacher in Portland implemented vibration platforms in her classroom, giving deaf students access to music education everyone insisted required hearing. Her students didn't just participate, they excelled, creating compositions that translated emotion into sensation with a kind of sophistication that came from experiencing sound as physics rather than prettiness. A grandfather in Alabama built a modified rocking chair that hummed lullabies through vibration, rocking his deaf grandson to sleep with songs the boy would never hear, but absolutely felt. He posted the design online for free, and within months, 50 families had replicated it, each one sending photos of children sleeping peacefully in chairs that sang without sound. The stories accumulated like evidence in a trial proving what Una had known 50 years ago. That connection didn't require ears, that communication predated language, that barriers often existed in assumptions rather than biology. Doctors who dismissed Theo's case as statistical anomaly started revisiting their protocols. Not all of them. Skepticism died hard in fields that worship peer review. But enough. Enough that research funding shifted slightly, that alternative therapies gained traction, that families were offered options beyond cochlear implants and sign language. The village surrounding the Crane estate transformed too. What had been an isolated mansion occupied by people locals barely knew became a community hub. The Una stage hosted concerts every month, but also workshops where Lydia taught her methods to anyone willing to learn. Parents brought deaf children. Teachers brought curiosity. Skeptics brought doubt that usually dissolved within an hour of watching Theo work with kids who'd been told their whole lives they couldn't vocalize. Harrison funded scholarships for families who couldn't afford specialized equipment. Not charity, investment. Investment in a future where deaf children weren't expected to conform to hearing standards, but were given tools to exist fully as themselves, whatever that looked like for their individual neurology. The power imbalance that had defined the Crane family's relationship with their community reversed. Harrison wasn't the wealthy benefactor bestowing favors anymore. He was a father who'd been taught by a housekeeper, who'd learned that wisdom didn't correlate with income, that the most valuable knowledge often lived in people's society had trained itself not to see. Lydia became the village's unofficial guide, the person families called when diagnoses felt like sentencing, when doctors offered only limitation, when hope seemed irresponsible in the face of medical certainty. She'd arrive with her wooden pendant, her grandmother's philosophy, and the kind of patience that communicated. Your child isn't broken. The world just hasn't learned their language yet. Faith communities struggled with how to categorize what happened. Was it miracle or science? Divine intervention or neuroplasticity? The debate raged in churches and online forums, in theology papers and medical journals. But the families living it didn't care about categories. They cared that their children were communicating, connecting, discovering voices everyone said didn't exist. They cared that isolation was being replaced with community, that their kids had living proof, in Theo, in each other. That limitation was often just failure of imagination given medical terminology. One evening, sitting on the Una stage after a particularly powerful concert, Lydia watched the sun set over grounds that had nearly burned, over a community that had nearly missed what mattered, because wealth had built walls between people who needed each other. "We're not special," she said to Harrison, who sat beside her with Theo asleep against his shoulder. Una wasn't special. Theo isn't special. We just refused to accept that impossible was the final answer. Harrison nodded, understanding what she meant. That courage often looked like quiet persistence, that revolutions happened in living rooms and community centers, that the most powerful force in the world was someone believing in you when everyone else had written you off. Comment, "I believe in quiet miracles," if you'd stand beside someone when no one else did. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is believe in potential everyone else has declared dead. 3 years after the Una stage opened, Theo stood before an audience of 200 people, half deaf, half hearing, all waiting to see what the 15-year-old who'd rewritten medical understanding of speech development had to share. He didn't give a lecture, didn't present data or argue for funding or perform the kind of inspiration theater that turned disabled people into motivational content for able-bodied consumption. Instead, he hummed, low and steady, a vibration that traveled through the stage's engineered platform, through the ground beneath the audience's feet, through the air that carried sensation as readily as it carried sound. The note hung there, simple, pure, intentional. Then he invited others to join. Slowly, tentatively, the audience hummed back. Deaf children who'd learned to vocalize through Lydia's methods. hearing parents who'd learned to communicate through their children's language instead of demanding translation. Teachers, therapists, siblings, grandparents, all of them creating a collective vibration that was part music, part conversation, part prayer to whatever force allowed connection to exist across every barrier humans invented. The harmony was imperfect. Notes clashed. Rhythms didn't quite align. Some voices came out rough, others smooth, some barely audible while others dominated. But it was real, present, undeniable. Theo signed while humming, his body becoming a bridge between communication methods, refusing to privilege one over another. His voice had matured, still carried markers of speech learned through touch, but confident now, certain of its right to exist exactly as it was. My grandmother, not by blood, but by choice, used to say that everyone speaks, even in silence. Theo's voice carried across the stage, his hands moving in fluid sign language that mirrored his words. She said the world was just too loud to hear what quiet people were saying. He paused, letting the statement settle. But quiet isn't the same as silent, and silence isn't the same as nothing. From the audience, a 7-year-old girl stood, one of the first children Lydia had worked with after Theo, a girl whose parents had been told cochlear implants were her only option for communication. She hummed a response to Theo's note, her pitch perfect, not because she heard herself, but because she felt resonance, felt when her frequency matched the vibrations traveling through the platform beneath her feet. Theo hummed back, creating a duet that required no ears, no hearing aids, no medical intervention beyond two people willing to meet each other in a language older than words. Other children joined. Then adults. Then the entire audience was humming, some on pitch, some off, some just breathing intentionally, because that was their version of participation, and it counted just as much as any trained vocalist contribution. Harrison stood at the back, watching his son lead a community through communication that transcended every boundary language typically required. Tears streamed down his face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of witnessing what almost didn't happen. If he'd fired Lydia that day in the hallway, if he'd insisted on traditional therapy, if he'd let fear and control dictate his son's development instead of learning to trust what he didn't understand, Theo would still be silent, not because he couldn't speak, but because no one would have shown him the pathway that made sense for his body. Lydia appeared beside Harrison, her hair fully silver now, face lined with the kind of aging that came from laughing more than worrying. She leaned against him, not as employee to employer, but as family, as the person who taught him that wealth meant nothing if you didn't know who to trust with the things money couldn't buy. She would burst with pride, Lydia whispered, though whether she meant Una or Siobhan or some combination of every person who'd ever been told their way of existing wasn't valid enough. Harrison couldn't tell. "They're all here," Harrison said, gesturing to the audience, to the children humming, to the future being built by people who refused to accept that impossible was permanent. Everyone who believed when believing seemed foolish. They're here in every kid who vocalizes, in every family that learns to listen differently. The humming crescendoed, not toward any traditional musical climax, but toward a collective expression of presence, of bodies announcing they existed, they mattered, they had something to contribute that the world needed even if the world didn't know it yet. Theo raised his hands and the humming softened, didn't stop but gentled into something that felt like meditation made audible. He signed his closing statement, his voice carrying the words simultaneously. We're told that disability means less than. That deafness is deficit. That difference requires fixing. His hands moved with the kind of grace that came from fluency earned through necessity. But I'm not less than. I'm not broken. I'm not waiting to be fixed. He pressed his hand against his chest, feeling his own heartbeat, his own breath, his own voice resonating through bone and tissue. I'm already whole. I'm already enough. I'm already speaking. You just had to learn my language. The audience erupted, not in applause, which half of them couldn't hear, but in collective humming that rose and fell like waves, like the patterns carved into Una's pendant, like every force in nature that existed, whether anyone was listening or not. Harrison pulled Lydia close, both of them crying openly now. Watching Theo stand in spotlight and vibration, watching the impossible made real through nothing more complicated than belief, patience, and the revolutionary act of meeting someone where they were instead of demanding they travel to where everyone else expected them to be. The sunset painted everything gold. The stage, the audience, the mansion in the background that had been rebuilt not as monument to wealth, but as laboratory for possibility. Light caught the edges of the wooden pendant around Theo's neck, Una's gift, traveling through time to arrive exactly where it was always meant to be. And somewhere in whatever space held the consciousness of people who died, but whose work refused to die with them. Una and Harrison's father and Siobhan watched the future they'd planted bloom into forests they'd never walked through, but had always believed would grow. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only manipulators won't. Because this story isn't about one family's journey. It's about every person who's ever been told they're not enough exactly as they are. Comment, everyone deserves a voice, if you'd stand against anyone silencing hope. Because, in the end, kindness always wins. Not because the world is fair, but because people like Lydia exist. People who see potential where others see problems, who build bridges instead of walls, who hum into darkness until someone hums back. And that changes everything.